The first thing anyone noticed about him that October morning was the frost on his coat, silvered along the shoulders where the night had settled and forgotten to leave. He rode down out of the San Juan range slow, the way a man rides when he has been in the saddle since before first light and does not want to spook whatever hope waits at the end of the road. His hat was pulled low. The bay gelding under him moved careful over the frozen ruts, breath ghosting in the thin Colorado air. Behind him, the peaks caught the early sun and threw it back gold. Below him, in the little valley south of Durango, a woman was already out in a pasture that had begun to fail her, and she did not yet know he was coming. Her name was Sarah Whitfield, and she was 34 years old, and she had been a widow for 1 year and 8 months. Her husband Thomas had gone through the ice on the Animas the second week of February in 1886, chasing a stray heifer that had wandered off in a squall, and by the time the neighbors pulled him free he was already gone. He had left her 160 acres of good bottom land along a bend in the creek, 42 head of mixed cattle, a barn with a sagging roof, a 2-room cabin that faced the wrong direction for the winter light, and 2 children. Caleb was 9 that fall. Ruth was 6. Ruth had stopped speaking for 4 months after the funeral and had only begun again in the spring, in the middle of feeding chickens, as if the words had been waiting for warmer weather. Sarah kept the ranch running because she did not know how to do anything else, and because the alternative, selling out to Harlan Crow, the big rancher whose fence line pressed against her north pasture, was not an alternative she would allow herself to consider. She was mending a broken section of the north fence when she saw the rider come down the county road. She stood up slow, one gloved hand at the small of her back where a year of doing 2 people's work had settled into a permanent ache, and she watched him. She was tall for a woman, 5'9", with dark hair pulled back under a wide-brimmed wool hat and pinned tight against the wind. She wore a long charcoal gray wool skirt that fell past the tops of her worn leather boots, a heavy cream-colored blouse buttoned to the throat, a man's canvas work coat that had been her husband's, and worn leather work gloves. Her eyes were gray-blue, steady, the color of a creek in November. She did not wave. She waited. He reined up 10 yards from the fence and touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," he said, "I was told in Durango you might have work for a man who could swing a hammer." His voice was low and quiet, the voice of a man who had learned early that shouting rarely accomplished what he needed accomplishing. He was maybe 36, weathered, with a short dark beard going gray at the corners of his jaw, hazel eyes set deep under a serious brow, a straight nose that had been broken once and healed a little off, and hands, she noticed, that were larger than any hands she had seen in a long time, roped with the flat corded veins of a man who had done heavy labor for a living for 20 years. He wore a dark brown canvas coat, faded blue denim trousers, tall brown work boots scuffed pale at the toes, a gray wool shirt, and a battered fawn hat with a sweat-stained band. There was a Winchester in a scabbard along his saddle and a bedroll behind the cantle and nothing else that she could see. "I might," she said. "Winter's coming, and I'm short-handed." "Who told you?" "Miss Ellen at the boarding house. She said the Whitfield place had lost its man and hadn't found another." Sarah felt the old flare go through her, the one that came whenever a stranger reduced her husband to that phrase, and she pushed it down because Miss Ellen had meant it kindly and because this man was watching her face and not looking away. He had said it plain. He had not made it soft. She respected that. "What's your name?" she said. "Ethan Callaway." "Where from?" "Last from a spread down in the San Luis Valley. Before that, 3 years in Wyoming. Before that, other places." "References?" He drew a folded paper from inside his coat and held it out over the fence. She took it, read it. A short note in a rancher's blocky hand attesting that Ethan Callaway was honest, hard-working, and knew cattle, and handed it back. "I can pay you $15 a month, and a bunk in the tack room and 3 meals," she said. "Which is less than you're worth." "I know it. Is what I have. 15's fine. You haven't asked what the work is." "I can see what the work is, ma'am." He was looking past her, at the fence she had been mending, and at the sagging barn roof beyond it, and at the smoke rising thin from her cabin chimney a 1/4 mile off. He was not looking at her the way men had begun looking at her in Durango, which was as a problem to be solved by their own presence. He was looking at the work. That was the first thing she noticed about him, and she remembered it later for a long time. Then start tomorrow, she said. Sun up. I'll show you the tack room. He nodded once. He did not smile. He turned the bay gelding and rode him at a walk toward the barn, and Sarah went back to her fence, and she did not permit herself to feel relieved, because relief was a luxury she had stopped allowing herself in February of 1886. That was a Wednesday. On Thursday morning, before she had finished her coffee, she heard the sound of a hammer. She stepped out onto the porch in her wrapper with the coffee cup still in her hand, and she looked toward the barn. He was up on the barn roof. He had already, in the hour and a half between first light and her waking, pulled the worst of the rotted shakes and stacked them clean, and he was laying new cedar shingles from a bundle she had bought in August and had not been able to lift up there alone. He worked quiet. He did not sing. He did not talk to himself. The hammer struck once, twice, 3 times, paused, moved. He was fast without hurrying. That was the second thing she noticed. She did not call him down for breakfast because she did not want to interrupt him. She left a plate on the workbench in the barn with a cloth over it. Biscuits, bacon, 2 fried eggs, a wedge of the previous night's dried apple pie, and she went out to the pasture to move the heifers to the second field. When she came back at noon, the plate was empty and washed and set upside down on the cloth, and there were 40 new shingles on the barn roof, and Ethan Callaway was already down at the north fence, splicing the wire she had been fighting the day before. He did not tell her he was going to fix the fence. He fixed it. That week, 5 things happened without discussion. The barn roof stopped leaking. The north fence held. The pump handle at the well, which had been sticking since August, worked smooth. The kindling box by the cabin door filled itself every evening. The loose porch step no longer gave under her boot when she came in with an armload of laundry. The bay gelding began to nicker when it heard her step at the barn door, which meant Ethan had taught it, without teaching it, that she was welcome there. And on Friday, when Caleb came home from the schoolhouse in Durango on his mule with his lip cut and his eye swelling shut from a fight with the Ferguson boy over something no 9-year-old could later explain, Ethan Callaway was there in the yard when the boy rode in, and he looked at the eye and he said, "Quiet, come on, son. Let's put a cold rag on it and see what your mama thinks." Caleb, who had been a shadow of himself for a year and 8 months, followed him into the barn without a word. Grief doesn't leave. It just learns to share the house with other things. By the second week of October, Sarah understood something about her new hand that she had not understood on Wednesday. She understood it not because he had told her anything, but because she had been raised by a father who ran cattle and a mother who read men the way other women read patterns in cloth, and because she had watched for a week the way Ethan Callaway carried his shoulders when he did not know she was watching, and the way he set a tool down at the end of a task rather than dropping it, and the way he spoke to the bay gelding in the barn when he thought no one was there. He was not a drifter. He was competent in a way that drifters were not. He knew when a heifer was going to slip a calf a full day before Sarah did. He knew how to set a fence post so it would hold through a spring thaw. He had a way of walking up to a spooked horse that made the horse decide to be unspooked, and Sarah watched him do this 3 separate times before she stopped being surprised by it. But he did not talk about himself. When Ruth, who had begun following him at a distance of about 10 feet, finally worked up the courage to ask him one evening whether he had a wife somewhere, he crouched down so his hazel eyes were level with her small face, and he said, "No, little one, I don't." And Ruth had nodded, satisfied, and gone back to the porch. He did not offer more. Sarah did not ask. She learned the rest in pieces, weeks apart, and never all at once. On a gray Saturday in the 3rd week of October, Harlan Crow rode down the county road on a tall roan with 2 of his men behind him. Harlan Crow was 52, a big square-shouldered man with silver mustaches and a good black hat and a voice that had been trained, over 30 years of getting his way in southern Colorado, to sound reasonable. He was reasonable. That was the thing about him. He owned 6,000 acres north of Sarah's line, and he wanted the 1,660 acres that made up her bottom land because her creek was better than his creek, and he had been telling her so, in perfectly courteous language, once a month since the March after Thomas died. He reined up at her gate and he touched his hat and he said, "Mrs. Whitfield, I thought I'd ride down and see how you were faring, with winter coming on." Sarah walked out to the gate. Ethan Callaway was in the corral behind the barn, working a 2-year-old colt on a lead line, and he did not look up, and she knew, without looking, that he was listening. "I'm faring," she said. "I heard you took on a hand." "I did. That's a hard cost on a place your size. 15 a month, meals, bunk. I guess 40 a month all in, once you count the feed for his horse and the coffee he drinks. And the winter's going to be a hard one, Mrs. Whitfield. The old fellas in town are saying the aspens turned early, which means snow before Thanksgiving. I've seen aspens turn early before, Mr. Crow. I'm sure you have." He smiled, gentle. "I'll be plain, ma'am, because I respect you and I don't want to waste your afternoon. I'll offer you $32 an acre for the whole 160. That's a fair price. That's better than fair. That's $5,120 in your hand before the first hard snow, and a house in Durango for you and the children, and no more fences to mend and no more roofs to patch. It's the best interest of your family, Mrs. Whitfield. I say that as a neighbor." Sarah did not answer at once. She looked at him. She looked past him, down the county road, back toward the mountains. She thought of Thomas, who had wanted this land more than he had wanted anything, who had cleared the south field himself in the summer of 1882 with a mule and a stone boat and a level of stubbornness she had loved and resented in equal measure. She thought of Caleb, who slept every night with his father's old belt knife under his pillow. She thought of Ruth, who had said her first word in 4 months out in the chicken yard in the spring. She thought of the east-facing kitchen window Thomas had always meant to build and never had, so that the morning light would come in over the sink where she stood every dawn. "That is a fair price, Mr. Crow," she said. "It is not what my land is worth to me." Harlan Crow nodded, slow, as if she had said something he had already prepared for. "I understand, ma'am. I'll come back at Christmas. Winters change a person's mind." He touched his hat. He turned the roan. He rode away with his 2 men, unhurried, the way a man rides when he is certain the country belongs to him and always will. That evening at supper, Ethan Callaway said, without preamble, "He's the one who owns the North Spread. Yes, he'll be back." He said he would. Ethan set his fork down. He looked at her across the table. Ruth was on the floor with her rag doll. Caleb was reading a schoolbook by the lamp. The stove ticked. "Ma'am," Ethan said, "if it's all right with you, I'd like to start on the east side of your cabin tomorrow. There's a window frame there that's been penciled in on your sill since last spring. I saw the mark. I figured you meant to put one in and didn't have the hands for it." Sarah felt something in her chest do a thing it had not done in a year and 8 months. She did not name it. She said that was Thomas's plan. "Then I'll build it to his plan," Ethan said. "So you'd have good light." That was on a Saturday. On Sunday he was up on the east wall with a saw and a level and a stack of dressed pine boards he had bought with his own first week's wages down in Durango and hauled back on a borrowed wagon. He did not ask her permission. He did not ask her opinion of the size. He measured the wall himself, and he measured the sun's angle at 7 in the morning himself, and he cut a window opening that was 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, framed it clean, hung the sash he had made in the tack room by lamplight, and glazed it with 4 panes of good glass from the Durango Mercantile. He did the whole thing in 4 days. On Wednesday evening he came in from the yard, hat in his hand, and said, "Quiet, it's done, ma'am." Sarah walked out onto the porch and around the side of the cabin, and she stood in the yard and looked at the east wall of her own house, and the new window caught the last of the sun, and she did not cry, because she had not cried since February of 1886, and she was not going to start now over a window. She looked at Ethan Callaway and she said, "Thank you." "You're welcome, ma'am." He walked back to the tack room. She stood a long time in the yard. That is what love looks like when it doesn't announce itself. It just quietly faces east. In the 4th week of October, on a Tuesday that was not a delivery day, Miss Ellen from the Durango boarding house rode down the county road in a 2-wheel trap and brought Sarah a jar of pickled crab apples and a piece of gossip. Not a Tuesday, which Sarah noticed. Miss Ellen was 61 and small and sharp and had been Thomas Whitfield's mother's best friend before Thomas's mother died. And she had appointed herself, without invitation, the guardian of Sarah's practical interests. Harlan Crow, Miss Ellen said, from the kitchen table, has been at the county recorder's office 3 times this month. Doing what? Asking after your title. Asking after your water rights. Asking whether the creek boundary was ever surveyed proper in your husband's grant. which as we both know it was not, because your husband did his own surveying with a rope and a stubborn streak. Sarah set down her cup. He means to challenge the creek line. He means to try. If he can push your boundary in 20 yards, he takes the main bend, and then he owns the water, and then your bottom land is worth 30 an acre to him and 20 to anyone else, and he waits you out through the winter. Sarah looked out through her new east window. The morning light lay across the kitchen floor like a promise she had not asked for and could not now refuse. She could hear Ethan out in the barn, feeding the bay. "How long do I have?" Sarah said. "Not long. A month at the outside. Maybe less. He'll file after the first hard snow. That's how he did the Petersons and the Hallidays. Snow slows the county surveyor. By the time a man rides out to check a fence in March, the fence has been where Harlan says it is for 4 months, and 3 witnesses in Durango will swear they saw it there." Sarah nodded. She thanked Miss Ellen. She walked her out to the trap. She stood in the yard until the trap was gone down the road. Then she walked to the barn. Ethan looked up from the bay's near hoof. He read her face the way he read horses. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He listened. He did not interrupt. When she was done, he set the hoof down gentle and he wiped his hands on a rag and he said, "Then we survey the creek line ourselves. This week. With witnesses. And we set a fence on it that Harlan Crow won't move in the dark. That's a lot of fence in a week before snow. It's what the week is for, ma'am." He rode into Durango that afternoon and came back at dusk with the county surveyor, a thin, nervous man named Peel who owed Miss Ellen a favor from a bad winter 3 years back, and with 2 wagon loads of good cedar posts and 4 spools of new barbed wire and a signed and witnessed plat map showing the true bend of the creek as it had been recorded, in fact, in the 1882 grant. They worked 5 days. Ethan and Peel and Caleb, who was allowed off school on account of the necessity, and old Mr. Halliday from 3 miles up the county road, who was 70 and could not swing a maul anymore but who could sight a line down a length of wire with an eye that had not lost a degree in 50 years, and who had, Sarah learned, hated Harlan Crow since 1879 for reasons no one would tell her. They set 84 posts along the true creek bend. Ethan dug 31 of the holes himself. On the 3rd day the temperature dropped and the ground began to freeze at night, and he worked by lantern until 11, and Sarah brought him coffee at 9 and stood beside him in the cold and did not speak, and he did not speak either, and they were both, for a moment, standing very still on the same piece of ground. On the 6th day, which was a Saturday, the fence stood finished along the true line, and Peel signed and stamped his plat, and Mr. Halliday signed as a witness, and Caleb, at 9 years and 3 months, signed as a second witness in a hand so careful it made Sarah's throat close. The next Wednesday, Harlan Crow came down the road. He came alone this time on the tall roan, in a black coat with the wind coming down out of the San Juans behind him, and he reined up at the new fence, at the exact point where his old claim had ended and his intended claim had begun, and he sat his horse and he looked at the cedar posts and the new wire, and he looked at the plat map nailed inside a glass case on the corner post, and he looked at Sarah, who was walking up to meet him from the cabin, and behind her, at a distance of about 15 feet, Ethan Callaway in his brown canvas coat and his fawn hat, walking easy, both hands empty. Harlan Crow touched his hat. "Mrs. Whitfield." "Mr. Crow. You've been busy." "I have. That's a lot of fence, ma'am, for a place your size. It's on the line, Mr. Crow. The true line. Recorded in 82. Surveyed and witnessed this week. It's in the case if you'd like to read it." He looked at the case. He looked at the plat. He looked, a long moment, at Ethan, who had stopped at Sarah's shoulder, 1 step behind, and who was looking at Harlan the way a good stockman looks at a bull that has not yet decided whether it wants to charge. "I've been in this country 30 years, Mrs. Whitfield," Harlan Crow said, "and I have never once taken an acre I didn't buy fair." "Then we're agreed, Mr. Crow," Sarah said. "The line's the line." There was a silence at the fence then that went on long enough to matter. Harlan Crow was not a cartoon and he was not a coward, and he was, in his own way, a man who had built what he built by keeping certain accounts inside himself in order. He looked at the fence a second time. He looked at Sarah. Then he did something Sarah did not expect. He swung down off the roan, slow, and he walked over to the case, and he read the plat map, and he read it twice, and he stood there a full minute with his hand on the top of the corner post, and Sarah saw his jaw work once. "Your husband," Harlan Crow said at last, without turning around, "surveyed this himself. In 82. With a rope. He did. He was a stubborn man, Mrs. Whitfield. He was. Harlan Crow nodded once, slow at the post. I'd forgotten how stubborn. He turned back and he looked at her, and for the first time in 19 months there was something in his face that was not the reasonable mask. I won't come at your creek again, ma'am. Not through the recorder. Not through the survey. Not anyway. You have my word on it, and you can hold me to it in front of any man in Durango. He paused. And I am sorry, ma'am, that I made you fight for what was already yours. He mounted the roan. He touched his hat. He rode back up the county road, unhurried, but not the same unhurried as before. Sarah watched him go. Ethan Callaway stood at her shoulder and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. The line's the line. The first hard snow came the second week of November, on a Thursday, and it came at 3 in the afternoon and did not stop until Saturday morning. 14 inches on the level, drifts to the eaves on the north side of the barn. Sarah and Ethan and Caleb worked through Friday moving the cattle to the sheltered pasture south of the creek, and Ruth stood at the new east window with her nose against the glass and watched the world go white. And when Sarah came in at dark with her lashes iced and her hands stiff, Ruth said, without turning, "The window is a good one, Mama. It is sweet." Mr. Callaway made it face the light. He did. Ruth was quiet a moment. Then she said, "I like it when he's here." Sarah stood in her kitchen with her hand on her daughter's small warm shoulder, and she looked out at the barn where a lantern was moving from stall to stall, checking on each animal by name, and she did not answer, because she did not know yet what to answer. Grief doesn't leave. It just learns to share the house with other things. On the second Sunday in December, on a still, cold, blue-shadowed afternoon after the second big snow, Sarah walked out to the north fence alone. She did not know she was walking there until she was there. The fence stood clean along the true line, cedar posts dark against the white, wire tight, the plat case glinting. She stood at the fourth post from the corner, which was the point at which the old claim had ended and the true claim, hers, began, and she put her gloved hand on the top of the post. Ethan came up behind her, quiet on the snow, the way he came up on horses. He stopped 4 feet away. "Mum." Mr. Callaway. The San Juan stood behind him, hard and white against a hard blue sky, and the cottonwoods along the creek were bare and black, and somewhere behind them, in the cabin, Ruth was singing something small to her rag doll and Caleb was reading, and the smoke went up straight from the chimney because there was no wind that afternoon at all. "I hired you in October," Sarah said, "because I was short-handed." "Yes." "Mum, you have not been a hand for 6 weeks." He did not answer. "You built me a window that my husband meant to build and did not live to build. You fenced my creek line. You taught my son to sit a horse without gripping. You told my daughter, when she asked, that you did not have a wife somewhere. I would like to know why." Ethan Callaway took off his hat. He held it against his chest. In the flat winter light his hazel eyes were very steady, and he did not look at the ground the way a man looks at the ground when he is about to lie, and he did not look at the sky the way a man looks at the sky when he is about to make a speech. "I had a wife, ma'am," he said. "Her name was Mary. We lost her and our little girl in a bad spring in Wyoming in 1882. Diphtheria in the throat. Mary went on a Tuesday. Anna went on the Thursday after. I buried them both on the same hill, and I rode out of Wyoming the following spring, and I have been moving ever since. I did not tell you because I did not want you to hire me out of pity, which you would not have done, or refuse me out of caution, which you might." Sarah did not speak. "I told Ruth I did not have a wife," Ethan said, "because I do not. Not anymore. I have not, ma'am, in 5 years. What I had in Wyoming I put in the ground, and what I have carried since then is not a wife and is not a life and is not, most days, even a plan. It is only the next fence and the next roof and the next stretch of country I have not yet failed to be useful in. What I have, ma'am, is a set of hands, and a back that is still good for another 20 years, and a kind of quiet that will not press on you or your children if you would rather have it quiet." Sarah looked at him a long moment. The creek ran black and slow under a rind of ice below them, and the world was very still. "Mr. Callaway," she said, "the line's the line, is it not?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then step over it." He did not move at once. He looked at her. She saw him understand. She saw him understand that this was a fence line and that on one side of it he was a hired hand and on the other side of it he was something else, and that she was, in her plain, quiet way, inviting him across. He stepped over the wire. He set his hat back on his head, careful. He took her gloved hand in his own, careful, and he did not say anything at all, because there was nothing that needed saying that had not already been built into a roof, a pump handle, a fence, and a window facing east. They walked back to the cabin together through the snow. By the time the aspens turned again the following September, 10 full months from the afternoon Ethan Callaway had first ridden down out of the range with frost on his coat. The barn had a new loft, the south pasture had been refenced, the herd was up to 61 head, Caleb was 10 and could rope a calf clean on his second throw. Ruth was 7 and had begun to write her letters in a careful, serious hand. And Ethan Callaway had built a small second bedroom onto the east side of the cabin so that Ruth could have a room of her own beside the window, and Sarah, at 35, had begun to sleep the whole night through for the first time in 19 months. Harlan Crow kept his word. In April he sent a man down with a good bull calf as a neighbor gift, and no note and no explanation, and Sarah accepted it, because a man's word in this country is a thing you honor when he honors it first. Miss Ellen came for supper every second Sunday and pretended not to notice things she noticed. Old Mr. Halliday died in his sleep in June and left his sighting eye, so to speak, to Caleb in his will, along with a good coil of rope. On a Tuesday morning in late September, in the good clean gold light coming through the east window over the kitchen sink, Sarah stood washing a coffee cup, and Ethan came in from the yard with frost on his shoulders, silvered along the coat the way the morning he had ridden down out of the range a year before, and he set his hat on the peg by the door and he said, "Quiet, ma'am." "Sarah," she said, without turning, "into the light." "Sarah," he said. She smiled, small, into the window. "You do not always get to choose the door grief comes in by. You do not always get to choose the door love comes in by, either. Sometimes it comes in on a bay gelding in October with frost on its coat, riding down out of a range you did not know it was up in, and it does not announce itself, and it does not press, and it just picks up a hammer and begins quiet to build. If you have been waiting, friend, wherever you are watching from, waiting for the loud declaration, waiting for the grand gesture, waiting for the man or the woman who arrives with music and roses, I will tell you what this valley taught me. Love that lasts does not arrive that way. Love that lasts arrives with a hammer, and a level, and a plain willingness to fix the roof before it asks to be thanked. Watch the hands. Watch what gets built. Watch which way the window faces. Thank you for riding with us today. If the story warmed you, stay a while, because there is another one waiting up the road. A young schoolteacher in the Wyoming plains, a rancher who has not spoken to a woman in 7 years, and a January blizzard that will not let either of them leave. That story is next. Until next time, keep riding.